Afternoon, folks. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations here in IEEE-USA headquarters in Washington, D.C. We have a cold, rainy spring day in Washington, but lots and lots of exciting stuff going on. But before we get to that, two things. First of all, if you have any questions or comments about today's discussion, feel free to put them in the comment box on your screen. And second of all, I need to apologize for not wearing my green tie today. I completely forgot today was St. Patrick's Day until I was already at the office. So on behalf of to all Irish Americans, which is all Americans on St. Patrick's Day, I apologize for wearing the wrong tie. And on that note, today is, of course, St. Patrick's Day, but two other major engineering events occurred today. Excuse me. In 1949, the very first Porsche was revealed to the public. It was revealed at a car show in Switzerland. And then in 1961, the first Jaguar E-Type was revealed to the public at another car show in Europe. So not only is today the great Irish Heritage Day, but it is the anniversary of two great engineering accomplishments in the automotive world. Speaking of great accomplishments, we actually have a budget. The fiscal year 2022 budget passed last week. It was just shy of 6 months into the fiscal year, which is not ideal, but they got it done. And, you know, I had told some of my colleagues here in the office I didn't think they'd do it. I thought they would just punt and do a year-long CR, but they didn't. They got it done, and it has been signed into law. The chart on your screen now is actually a very good summary of the entire debate over the budget this year. The chart comes from AAAS, but the light orange column there is the defense discretionary budget and the non-defense discretionary budget numbers from the White House and the House of Representatives. As you can see, the plan was to give defense a tiny little increase and then have a massive increase for everything else. This is in the discretionary budget only. The Senate did more or less the same thing, a little more money for defense, a little less money for non-defense. But the final budget numbers were close to parity. Defense budget was increased 5.6%, which is a decent increase. Non-defense was up 6.7%, a little bit better, but close. This was very close to the Republicans' demand in the Senate. They wanted absolute parity, didn't quite get there. But overall, and in the end, despite all the noise and all the arguing, Congress, for the most part, and we'll talk about a few exceptions, but for the most part, they passed on doing major changes to the budget. But they also passed on major cuts, which was good from us, from our perspective, because a couple of our programs early in the budget cycle were scheduled for significant reductions, and those did not happen. A couple highlights. The NSF, National Science Foundation budget was increased 4%, which is not a highlight. That's good. But the new Technology Innovations and Partnership Directorate was created through the budget. This is effectively the same thing as the Tech Directorate that was in the Endless Frontier Act, a version of the directorate that was in the Competes Act, neither one of which has passed yet. More on those in a minute. But this creates a new piece of the National Science Foundation to focus money and energy on technology and technological transfer. That's moving great ideas from academia into the private sector. The downside is, the bad news is that no budget was put into this program. The way Congress usually handles NSF's budget, there are a bunch of different directorates in the agency. Congress gives the entire agency a pot of money and then lets the NSF itself decide how much goes into each pot. We have a new directorate. It will be part of that conversation, but Congress didn't give it its own set-aside money, so the debate over this now shifts to the NSF itself. The significance of the creation of the directorate, however, is that it makes it easier for us to get tech-specific increases in the research budget in subsequent budget cycles. Thinking in Washington is that there will be a real push to get the deficit under control in next year's budget cycle, which will necessarily mean some budget cuts. And this will make it easier for us to defend our budget numbers, at least in the research area. The other big win was on the Defense Department research budget. You may recall that the original plan, and actually fairly late into the budget cycle, that the DoD R&D budgets were either going to have little tiny increases, or in some cases, some cuts. And as you can see from your screen, that did not happen. 6.1 and 6.2 got decent increases. 6.3 got a fairly substantial, almost a 20% increase. That's quite a bit. That is due pretty much entirely to the Ukraine, or more specifically to the Russians. Congress recognized the need to beef up our defenses and deployment of defense systems, and so they increased the budget for 6.3, which is the development of new weapon systems and Defense Department systems in general. DARPA, for the same reason, saw a significant increase of 10%. And NIST, much to our surprise and joy, got a nearly 20% increase, 19%. NIST often gets overlooked, but does a lot of very important things behind the scenes. IEEE-USA has prioritized making sure Congress remembers NIST for the past several years, and we're pleased to see that that paid off with a healthy increase. A couple other increases. The Department of Energy Office of Science got a decent increase. That was slated to actually get a massive increase and didn't, but 6.4 is still pretty good. The Bioresearch and Fusion Research offices got decent increases. The Office of Nuclear Energy, which is actually Department of Energy, not the Office of Science per se, but Department of Energy, got nearly a 10% increase. Now, this is consistent with other bills that have come out of Congress in the last year, mainly the infrastructure bill, which had significant investments in nuclear energy. The interesting thing is that nobody's talking about this. Very few legislators, every legislator put out a summary of the budget on their website. Almost none of them mentioned this investment. And what seems to be happening is that most of Congress is on board with the idea that the United States needs a more robust nuclear energy industry, and that we need to invest in that technology. But they also recognize that the public is skeptical, and parts of the public are passionately skeptical of nuclear energy. So they're hoping these investments don't get noticed. And so far they haven't. We're fine with that. We think nuclear energy is important, and we're glad they're investing in it. Overall, in the Department of Energy, though, we did see a fairly substantial last-minute shift from research budgets to kind of development and deployment budgets. That is, instead of putting money into energy research, they put money into energy systems. That is in part due to, Russia and the Ukraine. There is a lot of concern on Capitol Hill about vulnerabilities to our electrical grid. And obviously, the price of oil has demonstrated risk associated with dependence on foreign sources of energy. And so very late in the budget process, Congress shifted a bunch of money out of research into deployment. IEEE-USA is fine with that. We support both. And the research budgets did, for the most part, get decent increases. But, energy is important, not just researching it. And so we support both investments. One of the surprises for me was the NASA budget, which saw a 3.3% increase, which is fairly small, really. NASA was on the hook to get a fairly decent increase, again, until fairly late in the process. It was one of the casualties of the shift from non-defense to defense that we talked about a minute ago. Possibly the biggest winner in the research world was the Department of Transportation's R&D budget, which saw a 125% increase. Generally, you can't do much better than that. IEEE-USA generally doesn't pay a tremendous amount of attention to DoD R&D, but DOT is getting into autonomous vehicles and AI systems, and so are going to be more relevant to IEEE members than it has been in the past. Which is where a good chunk of this new money is going to go. So that's promising. So we can immediately change focus to the fiscal 2023 budget, which is due October 1st. We expect the president's budget next week. Originally, the White House had been saying it would be a skinny budget, which is just kind of top-line budget numbers. We're now being told that is not the case. That the president expects to get probably not a complete budget, but something closer to a complete budget up to Congress next week, so that Congress can start the 2023 budget process quickly, which is important because they're already about 6 weeks behind schedule, which is not a big deal. But Congress is going to prioritize getting the 2023 budget done before January. The reason for that is that the expectation is that Republicans will take back the House in November's elections and possibly the Senate. So Democratic leaders want very much to get their budget passed before Republicans take over the process, all of which does suggest that they'll be a little bit more timely in getting the budget done than they were this year. Good stuff going on in Compete's USICA. This is the Endless Frontier Act that we've been working on. Negotiations are continuing, although they appear not to be between the Senate and the House. They appear to be between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. Senators Schumer and McConnell are actually apparently negotiating directly, or their staff is, over the various versions of the bill. The idea is that USICA will be amended to address some of the ideas coming out of the House, and then the Senate will give it to the House for passage. The expectation is that this will be the next big bill that Congress debates, other than the Ukraine, which is rightfully getting a great deal of legislative time and attention at the moment. But other than the Ukraine, this is the next big bill to pass. We expect it to start moving end of this month, early next month, which is timely because that is exactly when our CVD Congressional Visits Day is, which I'll talk about in a minute. If you want a little more detail on IEEE-USA's position on USICA in particular, there is an op-ed that was written by our Vice President of Government Relations, Becky Taylor, in The Hill. For those of you not familiar with it, The Hill is one of the Washington, D.C. political newspapers that covers Congress and the White House. The op-ed is online. There's a link to it if you'd like to look for it. I think Becky did a pretty good job writing it. We're pretty pleased with the position we've taken. President Biden signed an executive order on cryptocurrency this week. The executive order itself, like most executive orders, is pretty vague and fluffy without a lot of specifics, but it does call for government agencies to conduct research and studies into what effect cryptocurrencies will have on whatever it is that agency does. They've asked a couple agencies, specifically the Treasury, to start developing steps to protect the public from the unique risks posed by cryptocurrencies. They asked the Commerce Department in particular to look for ways the government can use cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology more generally, and proposed a central bank of digital currency to regulate cryptocurrency and the cryptocurrency industry. Now, if you read the online or the accounts in the press about the impact of this executive order, some people are saying it's an absolutely necessary first step towards getting proper regulatory authority around cryptocurrency and reining in cryptocurrency in some cases. Other people have argued that it is the end of the crypto business and it will destroy the technology in the industry entirely. And other people have argued that it is utterly meaningless. I tend to think it is closer to the first option. Cryptocurrency is a real thing. It has real impacts on society and has real risks associated with it, which to me suggests that some government oversight is not only going to be required, but is going to happen whether it's required or not. And so the government, and particularly President Biden, instructing the government to start the process of figuring this out is not only a good thing, but it's necessary. They're going to have to do this at some point. Folks that think that crypto should be entirely unregulated and allowed to run amok any way it wants are simply being unrealistic. And, you know, a lot of these executive orders are just fluff. They're just there to kind of get some PR and get a couple nice stories. I don't think that's the case in this case. The fact is, a lot of the government, and frankly, I count myself not a member of the government, but among the people who don't really understand what crypto is, nor really understand its effect on the market. And so I think it is appropriate at this point for the president to simply call for research to be done. Let's start to have some serious discussion about what's happening, what could happen, and start to put some things in place to regulate and normalize cryptocurrency. Some interesting developments on the push on Capitol Hill to enact antitrust legislation aimed at the tech industry, or more accurately, tech regulation in general. the Republican Party has announced the creation of a big tech censorship and data working group. This is a set of legislators led by Congresswoman McMorris Rodgers from Eastern Washington State to look at, in particular, Section 230 and personal privacy concerns online. And now the purpose of this group, and the Republicans announced a number of them, is to develop a platform that the Republicans can either run on in November or simply use should they take over the House next year. And the betting line is still that that will happen. Now, the significance of this is that the Republicans are specifically not emphasizing antitrust actions. They're looking at other legal avenues they can pursue to rein in big tech. This is not what the Democrats are currently doing, which does increase pressure on Senator Klobuchar and the other Democrats that are trying to move the antitrust legislation, because the Republicans have sent a message that they're not going to pursue that next year if they take over. Now, we're a long way from next year. Who knows what will happen? Who knows what can be worked out in a new Congress? But I do think this move encourages the Democrats to be a little more aggressive on their antitrust efforts, which we are watching very carefully. A little bit on spectrum management. As all of you know, fights over spectrum and spectrum allocation are increasing and are going to continue to increase as demand for wireless spectrum increases. There is bipartisan, bicameral recognition that it's not just Congress, but all of Washington needs a better process for adjudicating disputes between different users of the electromagnetic spectrum. The process we use right now, which is basically a political fight of who has the better lobbyist, is simply not an effective way to allocate limited spectrum. And so some other process is needed. There was a useful hearing yesterday in the House Commerce Committee to discuss that, which is an important first step in figuring this out. Congressman Doyle and Latta, Democrat and Republican, published a letter in the Hill, I believe, or article in the Hill last week talking about this, all of which tells you that Congress is finally focusing on this. Spectrum management is a pretty arcane field. The public doesn't understand it, isn't going to understand it. But it's nice to see some legislators are stepping up and starting to have real conversations about what to do about it. A little bit of news in the standards world. There is a House Science Committee hearing. Well, it was this morning. Should be over by now. On setting the standards, strengthening U.S. leadership in technical standards. IEEE-USA is providing formal comments on that hearing, talking about what we view as an appropriate role for Congress to play in the standards world. Basically, that position is there are international standards that are predominantly governments negotiating standards between themselves. Congress should play a role in that. And then there are private standards processes, industry standards developed by organizations like the IEEE Standards Association, where Congress should really be a little bit more hesitant to get involved. Our process, like I said, is protecting the process, making sure Congress doesn't enact legislation that messes up something that works pretty well, and encouraging small businesses to engage in the process. Small businesses usually a voice that is missing from standards processes, simply because it's too expensive. You know, small businesses can't afford to have a standards guy on staff. And so the government taking steps to help small businesses participate, we think will make the process better and the standards better at the end. In political news, the Democrats have begun floating a new plan for the presidential primary process. As you probably know, the process for selecting a Republican and a Democratic candidate for president for many, many years has started in Iowa, moved to New Hampshire, and then gone other places, more recently to South Carolina and Nevada. There are lots of people that don't like that system, primarily everybody who doesn't live in Iowa and New Hampshire or South Carolina and Nevada. Most of the other states get far less attention from candidates than the first couple contests do, and far less attention from the media. So the Democrats have a new plan for their selection process. It would call for a ban on any primaries before the first Tuesday in March. That is the traditional Super Tuesday event where several dozen states have their primaries. And so the Democrats say nobody can have a primary before this date, except there will be 5 waivers to that rule given to 5 different states, and states will have to apply for those waivers. There will be no preference given to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, or Nevada. Doesn't mean those states couldn't be among the first states. It just means that they won't necessarily be among the first states. Democratic plan also gives preference to public primaries over caucuses. You may remember in the last presidential election, the Iowa caucus, the Democrats' Iowa caucus kind of blew up. There were major problems in the counting and tabulating of votes, and the Iowa Democratic Party was actually not able to produce results for several weeks, at which point everybody had moved on and nobody cared. There are some significant differences between a primary and a caucus. The most significant is a primary is a professional government-run election. It is run by full-time election people using government-owned ballots, and the ballots are processed and counted by the government, all of which tends to make it more professional. A caucus is a party-run event. It is run typically by volunteers. The caucus process itself is very chaotic. They're frankly a lot of fun, but they're hard to pull off. And they work pretty well if you have a small community, which Iowa used to have. But as the crowds get bigger, as the communities get bigger, they get really hard to pull off. And so the Democrats are clearly signaling that caucuses are out and that everybody should use a primary instead. The problem with that is that, as I said, primaries are public events. They're owned technically by the state, not by the party. And so state legislatures set their primaries, not the parties. The problem with that is that there are actually state laws in Iowa and New Hampshire that say their election process will go first. And just because the Democrats say New Hampshire can't have a primary prior to March 3rd does not mean New Hampshire can't have a primary before March 3rd. In fact, the state of New Hampshire can set its primary anywhere it wants. And the fact of the matter is the Democrats don't really have a lot of say over it. So there'll be some negotiation over this. Obviously, the Democrats have some pull. They can put pressure on a state, and certainly Democratic leaders in a state, to change the law, but this process is actually much more complicated than it seems. All of which is yet another sign that the role of the party in American politics continues to decline. There was once a time where the Republican Party and the Democratic Party basically got to pick their nominee without consulting anybody. They just did it. And party leaders could do that literally in a smoke-filled back room. That is not the case. The parties actually only have limited amount of authority over their own process for selecting their candidates and virtually none over who the candidates actually are. Not saying that's bad, just saying that is. I wanted to bring your attention to an event that we held on Tuesday. We had our second Live from the Hill town hall discussion with a member of Congress, in this case, Mr. G.K. Butterfield, representing the 1st District of North Carolina. Congressman Butterfield is a longtime supporter of STEM workers and STEM education, and a recipient of the IEEE-USA Public Service Award a year or two ago. And so we were thrilled to have him on. The event was hosted by IEEE members in North Carolina, and specifically in Mr. Butterfield's district, which is always great. It took us 2 months to negotiate this event, and I wanted to just dwell for a moment on why that is. Legislators are tremendously afraid of online communications, and the reason for that is that it is very easy to embarrass a legislator once you get them online and live. Since everything is recorded, everything is out in the public. If something goes wrong, somebody says something to embarrass a legislator, there's nothing they can do about it. And so we had to work, specifically my colleague James Savage, had to work very hard to make sure that Congressman Butterfield, and more importantly his staff, were comfortable with IEEE, comfortable with our process, and knew that this event was going to be exactly what it was, an honest discussion between a member of Congress and technologists from his state and district, which is what it was. Now, the bottom line of all this is that one of the conditions we had to agree to, and which we were happy to agree to, was that his staff gets to review the recording before it goes live, which is why the recording is not yet up on the internet. I have no doubt that they will approve it, but that was a condition that just in case we did something to embarrass the congressman, their staff could kill it before it was posted online. So we expect to have that recording up shortly. Hope you will all check it out and watch it. And we also hope to have more of these events moving forward. We're looking at a couple other offices that have already shown some interest in talking with us. Speaking of talking with Congress, the IEEE-USA Congressional Visits Day is coming up on April 5th and 6th. Registration is still open, although it will be closing soon. If you've not registered for this free service to IEEE members, I encourage you to do so quickly. We've already started getting meetings. We've already locked in actually more than a dozen meetings with sitting members of Congress, which is a fantastic start. So I hope you all will join us. Next update will be March 31st. We should be well through, unfortunately, spring already here in Washington. The cherry blossoms should be actually past full bloom by that point. But I hope you join us 1 o'clock on March 31st. And with that, I will turn to questions and comments in a moment. So please post your comments or questions if you have them. But before I do so, I am Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington. My phone number is 202-530-8326, and my email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. Please feel free to reach out anytime that IEEE-USA or IEEE can be of service. And with that, we will turn to comments. If I get my mouse to work, there we go. Oop, quite a few things here. Oops. Oh, my colleague, Jonathan Cho, has done a great job of posting links to everything I mentioned in the question and comment section. And I do not see any questions at this point. So we will move on. But before we do that, I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for listening, and remind you that I look forward to seeing you at our CVD on April 5th and 6th. Have a great afternoon.
I am trying to build a sustainable electronics industry. The things that we have just don't last as long as they used to, but they could. Every time a new gizmo comes out, we take it apart, find out what makes it tick. We need more engineers in the world. Engineers make the world better. They are designing the systems that keep the world working. So that's why I've been involved with IEEE-USA, is I want to see more kids get excited about engineering. We are working with IEEE-USA to create a world where repair is normal again.